Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Cell Block D, 11:23 a.m. Wednesday, March 15, 1956. The fog rolled thick across San Francisco Bay that morning, swallowing the island in gray silence. Inside the concrete tomb they called the Rock, the air tasted like salt, rust, and the bitter residue of broken dreams. The mess hall stretched before 247 of America's most dangerous men, killers, kidnappers, and kings of criminal empires, reduced to numbers on gray uniforms. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat at table 4, his back against the wall, eyes tracking every movement with the precision of a predator. At 51 years old, he had survived Sing Sing, Dannemora, and every street war Harlem could unleash. Alcatraz was designed to break men like him. It hadn't succeeded. In Harlem, Bumpy commanded armies with a whisper. Here, stripped of his tailored suits and diamond cufflinks, he wore the rough wool of federal prisoner 1117. But his posture remained unbroken. Other inmates, Italian capos, Irish gunmen, Jewish numbers runners, watched him with the careful attention reserved for dangerous animals. They understood what the guards refused to acknowledge. Some men carry their kingdoms inside them. Guard Sergeant William Billy Kowalski stood 6'2", 230 pounds of Chicago-bred contempt. 15 years in the federal system had taught him that respect was something you took, not something you earned. He particularly despised what he called uppity coloreds. Black inmates who refused to shuffle, refused to look down, refused to accept their place in the carefully constructed hierarchy of humiliation. Bumpy Johnson represented everything Kowalski hated. The serving line moved with military precision. Metal trays scraped across steel rails. Ladles splashed portions of gray meat and watered-down beans onto plates with mechanical indifference. When Kowalski reached Bumpy's tray, the mess hall went silent. 246 inmates stopped eating. They sensed it, the electric charge that precedes lightning. Kowalski held the ladle suspended over Bumpy's plate, letting the silence stretch like a wire about to snap. Then he hawked deep in his throat. The sound echoed off concrete walls like a gunshot. He spat, a thick, deliberate glob of saliva that landed directly in the center of Bumpy's food. The white mucus spread across the beans like an obscene flower blooming in slow motion. "Eat up, boy," Kowalski said, his voice loud enough for 3 tables to hear. Added some extra seasoning just for the Harlem King. Bumpy didn't move, didn't blink. His hands remained flat on the metal surface, fingers spread wide like a pianist preparing for a concerto of violence. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Inmates who had been watching quickly looked away, suddenly fascinated by their own trays. When Bumpy finally lifted his eyes, the contact was surgical. Cold. Calculating. He studied Kowalski's face with the clinical attention of a coroner examining a corpse. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every man within 30 feet heard it clearly. "You have 72 hours to apologize. Same place, same volume, in front of everybody." He paused, letting the words settle into the concrete and steel. 72 hours, or you don't walk off this rock the same way you walked on. Bumpy turned his back on the tray, on the spit, on the insult. He walked to his table, sat down, folded his hands, and stared straight ahead at nothing. He didn't eat. The message was clear: he would accept hunger before he would accept disrespect. Kowalski laughed, but the sound came out forced, hollow. He kicked the tray off the rail, letting it crash to the floor and splatter like a crime scene prediction. "Clock's ticking, Johnson," he sneered. "We'll see who's still standing in 72 hours. But everyone in that room understood the brutal mathematics. The clock wasn't ticking for Bumpy Johnson. It was counting down for William Kowalski. 71 hours and 37 minutes later, Alcatraz would erupt in the most systematically orchestrated riot in federal prison history. Sirens would scream, blood would stain the tiers, and two men would leave the island in body bags. One would carry a note pinned to his uniform with a sharpened spoon, "Respect is not negotiable." The story of how Sergeant Kowalski lost everything is a warning that the Bureau of Prisons tried to bury in classified files. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to March 15, 1956, and understand exactly how Bumpy Johnson turned maximum security into his personal courtroom. Alcatraz classified Ellsworth Raymond Johnson as inmate 1117, but the federal bureaucracy failed to understand a fundamental truth about power. Authority does not derive from uniforms or policy manuals. It flows from the absolute certainty of consequence. The Rock operated on two distinct systems of governance. The official one existed in Bureau of Prisons regulations and guard rotations. The real one lived in the silence between cell bars, in the careful choreography of mess hall seating, in the unspoken agreements that determined who walked safely and who disappeared into the hole. Bumpy understood both systems with surgical precision. The racial architecture of Alcatraz in 1956 was designed to break black inmates through systematic degradation. The all-white guard force, recruited from rural counties where Jim Crow was theology, administered psychological warfare as daily policy. Black prisoners occupied the worst cells in D Block, farthest from natural light, closest to the dampness that bred tuberculosis. Mail deliberately disappeared. Food arrived contaminated or cold. Medical requests vanished into bureaucratic silence until minor ailments became major emergencies. Random cell searches destroyed personal property with calculated cruelty. The message was constant and clear: you are less than human, and this concrete tomb exists to remind you every waking moment. Most men broke under this systematic brutality, lashing out in emotional outbursts that earned swift trips to solitary confinement. Bumpy operated with different mathematics. Violence was not emotional release but precision instrument, deployed only when the return on investment was guaranteed. His philosophy was brutal in its efficiency. Anger was expensive, emotion was weakness, and strategic retribution created order where chaos bred. When a white supremacist from Alabama made the mistake of using racial slurs during Bumpy's first week, the response came 72 hours later in the laundry room. Not a beating, but something permanent. The man's dominant hand was positioned against industrial pressing equipment during a carefully orchestrated accident. 3 fingers crushed beyond surgical repair. No witnesses. No evidence. Just consequence delivered with mathematical precision. For 18 months, Bumpy had constructed a respect economy that functioned beneath administrative noses. He provided legal advice to illiterate inmates, settled disputes before they turned bloody, and maintained stoic silence that earned begrudging respect from Italian mobsters and Irish gunmen who viewed most prisoners with contempt. When Fat Tony Salerno needed word sent to his family about pending indictments, Bumpy's Harlem network delivered within 48 hours. When Paddy McGrath required intelligence about rival Irish crews muscling his Boston territory, Bumpy provided accurate information. When corrupt guards needed contraband cigarette distribution organized without triggering investigation, Bumpy designed systems so elegant they operated for months undetected. Each favor created obligation. Each obligation became leverage. Each piece of leverage transformed into protection. Within 6 months, Bumpy could walk any yard, sit at any table, move through the prison, with immunity no official paperwork could provide. Different races, different crews, different creeds, all understood one fact. When Bumpy Johnson spoke, something happened. William Kowalski represented everything toxic about the system. 12 years with Chicago PD before an incident involving a black teenager in a South Side alley forced his resignation. 3 broken ribs, ruptured spleen, fractured skull delivered to a 17-year-old whose crime was talking back during a traffic stop. The police union negotiated his departure instead of prosecution. The Bureau welcomed him, understanding that certain types of aggression were assets in federal corrections. Kowalski brought Chicago prejudices to the Rock, where isolation and institutional protection allowed both to flourish without consequence. The unwritten law governing prison culture was older than America itself. Public disrespect demands public response. Not ego or pride, but survival. Accept humiliation without consequence signal weakness. Weakness attracts predators. Predators create victims. Victims don't survive. That evening, in the library's controlled chaos, Fat Tony Salerno approached Bumpy's corner table. His question was simple, direct. The kind men in their world understood, without elaboration. How much time do I have to get my people ready? Bumpy didn't look up from his book. 70 hours. Tell the others. Thursday morning broke with the deceptive calm of a receding tide before a tsunami. Routine was camouflage, predictability was weaponry. Bumpy rose when the lights snapped on, folded his blanket with military precision, and stood at his cell door at the exact second count was called. To casual observation, he remained compliant, disciplined, unremarkable. Inside his mind, the ticker had begun its relentless countdown, transforming Alcatraz from maximum security prison into a complex mathematical equation resolving itself in real time. He clocked guard Captain Morrison's rounds with accountant precision. 73 minutes. Clockwork reliable. The maintenance crew changed shifts at 8:30, creating a 12-minute window when tool inventory went unmonitored. The East Gun Gallery surveillance angle went blind for exactly 45 seconds during shift change at 8:14. Bumpy didn't need a watch. He kept time the way he had coordinated his multi-million-dollar Harlem numbers empire. By rhythm. By repetition. By the systematic alignment of small details into exploitable patterns. 17 policy banks, thousands of daily bets, 6 square miles of urban territory, all managed through memory and mathematical precision. Alcatraz presented different variables, but demanded identical skills. The alliance he was assembling operated on cold business logic, not friendship or trust. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno represented Italian interests with the same efficiency he once brought to East Harlem gambling operations. 240 pounds of calculated menace, Salerno had survived 3 assassination attempts through strategic thinking rather than brute force. Patrick McGrath controlled Irish operations with the quiet competence of a Boston numbers runner who understood that loud men died young. His crew maintained connections to longshoremen unions that moved everything from whiskey to weapons along the eastern seaboard. Samuel Red Levine, Meyer Lansky's most trusted lieutenant, brought Jewish organizational genius that could calculate profit margins faster than accountants with adding machines. The library became his boardroom. Under the guise of book exchanges, messages moved with silent efficiency between designated shelves. To Salerno, a copy of the Count of Monte Cristo contained a simple proposition. Bumpy would guarantee protection for Italian gambling operations from aggressive C-block shakedowns. His Harlem connections could apply pressure 3,000 miles away, making problems disappear through strategic phone calls. To McGrath, a Civil War history held offers of mainland distribution networks, opening new contraband markets worth years of post-release income. To Levine, a legal text promised intelligence about rival operations undermining Lansky's empire, information more valuable than gold in their world. Bumpy wasn't requesting favors. He was brokering business transactions with guaranteed returns. Each faction leader understood the mathematics immediately. Minimal investment, substantial payoff, invaluable message to the entire federal system about respecting invisible hierarchies. Kowalski's Friday morning routine was legendary among inmates. 6 o'clock to 7:30, he commanded the shower block alone, having convinced supervisors his presence prevented violence better than multiple guards. Those 90 minutes represented his personal theater of cruelty, where steam obscured cameras and running water drowned out sounds of systematic intimidation. He called it his power hour. Inmates called it torture. Administration called it effective deterrence. Bumpy called it exploitable isolation. He wasn't organizing chaos or random violence. He was orchestrating precision operation that would have impressed military strategists. Every variable calculated, every contingency planned, every participant understanding their exact role in choreographed demonstration of consequence. The destruction would appear spontaneous. The reality would be surgical. Friday morning, 5:45. Bumpy sat fully dressed on his bunk, back straight, hands folded, eyes focused on mathematical certainties only he could see. Guard Patterson walked past during routine count, noticed the unusual composure, stopped. "Johnson, you feeling all right?" "You're up early." Bumpy turned slowly, making eye contact with the deliberate precision of a man delivering prophecy. "Never better. But you might want to request a different assignment today. Things are about to get educational." At exactly 600 hours, William Kowalski pushed through the shower block door, coffee steaming in his left hand, nightstick swaying from his belt with each confident stride. He moved with the entitled swagger of a man who believed concrete walls answered to his authority. The tiled chamber stretched before him, empty except for rising steam and the familiar mixture of industrial soap and institutional fear. This was his arena for 90 minutes of systematic dominance, his private jurisdiction where intimidation became policy and humiliation transformed into art. By 6:03, the hot water died without warning. Steam collapsed into silence, leaving only hollow echoes of dripping pipes. Kowalski frowned, glancing upward at the suddenly cold showerheads, muttering about incompetent maintenance staff. 3 floors below in D-block utilities, inmate Rodriguez quietly returned a stolen valve component to its housing. The sabotage had lasted precisely 3 minutes, just long enough to draw Kowalski deeper into the room, away from exits, further from the sight lines of passing patrols. At 6:05, the East Wing erupted in carefully orchestrated chaos. Salerno's cellmate collapsed during morning count, convulsing on concrete with theatrical precision that would have earned standing ovations on Broadway. Foam, prepared from toothpaste and water, dripped from his mouth as his partner screamed for medical assistance with the panicked authenticity of genuine terror. 3 guards abandoned their posts, sprinting toward the emergency while shouting for stretchers and medical codes. Alcatraz protocol demanded immediate response to potential seizures. That policy had never been tested against coordinated multi-ethnic alliance with unified objective. 6:08 brought the closing of the trap. The shower block door swung inward with deliberate slowness, revealing 8 inmates entering in measured formation. Italian, Irish, Jewish, and Black. Different backgrounds, identical purpose. Men who under normal prison politics would murder each other over cigarette disputes now moved as single organism. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. This was not Riot. This was controlled operation. Kowalski's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, muscle memory responding to threat assessment. Static erupted instead of communication. Inmate Berkowitz, former Navy electronics technician serving 20 years for espionage, had constructed frequency jammer from contraband transistor components hidden in ventilation ducts. The device broadcast white noise across guard communication bands with crude but absolute effectiveness. Kowalski's second movement reached for his nightstick. His fingers closed on empty leather. The weapon had vanished during shift change confusion, lifted by McGrath's crew with pickpocket precision that would have impressed professional thieves. Bumpy entered last, carrying Kowalski's own nightstick with the casual authority of judge entering courtroom. He stopped 6 feet away, studying the guard with detached appraisal of surgeon examining patient before incision. When he spoke, his voice carried conversational calm, the tone of professor explaining simple mathematics to struggling student. "You spat in my food. That wasn't about nutrition. That was about respect. Now you learn what disrespect costs. No shouting, no threats, just cold explanation of transaction about to occur." The execution that followed transformed violence into education. Salerno's men positioned Kowalski's right hand against tile, palm down, fingers extended. The nightstick descended with orthopedic precision against each knuckle. Index finger, middle finger, ring finger. Each impact produced distinct crack like branches snapping in winter forest, methodical destruction of the hand that had delivered humiliation. The left kneecap came next. McGrath held the leg steady while Bumpy raised the nightstick high, bringing it down with calculated force against the patella. The bone shattered into fragments, destroying joint integrity with single blow designed to cripple without killing. No facial damage. Nothing visible in photographs that would trigger federal investigation. The injuries were specific, purposeful, designed to send message while maintaining plausible deniability. At 6:28, the 8 inmates dispersed through predetermined routes, melting back into general population like drops of water fading into ocean. Kowalski lay conscious but immobilized in 4 inches of cold water, his broken hand clutching his shattered knee, finally understanding the mathematics of respect he had spent years refusing to learn. Bumpy returned to his cell, selected a worn book from his collection, and began reading. Morning shift change would occur in 32 minutes. The alarms were inevitable. The consequence had already been delivered. At precisely 700 hours, Guard Patterson pushed through the shower block door expecting routine towel inventory and discovered William Kowalski lying conscious but shattered in 4 inches of water, now tinted pink with diluted blood. For 3 full seconds, Patterson's mind refused to process the visual equation before him. Then training overrode paralysis. The alarm system screamed across the island like wounded animals, steel doors slamming shut in rapid succession as lockdown protocols transformed Alcatraz into a tomb of echoing silence. But the real violence had ended 32 minutes earlier. What followed was theater, a carefully scripted performance where every inmate knew their lines and every alibi had been rehearsed to mathematical perfection. Warden James Madigan arrived within minutes, his face already calculating the career-ending implications spreading like cracks through concrete. The investigation commenced with military efficiency, pulling suspects from every cell block during the relevant time frame. Each interrogation hit identical walls constructed from alibis that defied statistical possibility. Fat Tony Salerno had been playing chess in the library with 3 Irish witnesses who swore under oath they were discussing legal appeals. Patrick McGrath was documented in the infirmary receiving treatment for chronic back pain, verified by medical staff and 4 Italian inmates who despised him. Samuel Levine had been observed in the recreation yard, his chess game witnessed by guards and prisoners alike. Bumpy Johnson never left his cell, confirmed by morning count records and Patterson's direct testimony. The mathematical impossibility was staggering. Sworn enemies from rival factions corroborating each other's movements with precision that would have impressed federal prosecutors. Kowalski's testimony, delivered through morphine haze and reconstructive surgery planning, created more confusion than clarity. He insisted multiple black inmates had orchestrated the attack, but steam had obscured faces, coordinated timing prevented clear identification, and traumatic shock fragmented memory into useless fragments. He described voices without distinguishing accents, movements without individual characteristics, violence without identifiable perpetrators. Under cross-examination by federal investigators, his accusations conflicted with documented locations of every black inmate in D Block. Without positive identification, his testimony became legally worthless, emotionally devastating, and strategically exactly what Bumpy had predicted. Then the deeper brilliance revealed itself through evidence collection that transformed crime scene into misdirection masterpiece. Investigators discovered crude shiv hidden in ventilation ducts near the shower block, wrapped in fabric torn from white supremacist inmate clothing. Anonymous notes surfaced suggesting Kowalski was being targeted by Aryan Brotherhood members for being soft on black prisoners, for failing to maintain proper racial hierarchy, for betraying unwritten codes governing guard culture. The false evidence pointed toward familiar narratives of white supremacist violence, creating investigative rabbit holes that consumed resources while protecting actual participants. Bumpy had redirected suspicion away from unprecedented multi-ethnic cooperation toward comfortable assumptions about prison racial dynamics. The psychological impact on the guard force was immediate and catastrophic. For years, they had operated on assumptions of absolute control backed by federal authority and concrete barriers. Now they confronted terrifying arithmetic of their isolation. The rock's walls kept inmates in, but they also kept reinforcements out. Unified, the prisoner population outnumbered guards 5-1. If Bumpy Johnson could coordinate systematic violence inside supposedly secure facilities without leaving prosecutable evidence, no uniform guaranteed safety. Fear replaced confidence in daily interactions. Routine patrols became cautious negotiations. Respect, previously demanded through institutional authority, now required careful consideration of invisible hierarchies that governed real power. Bureau of Prisons headquarters received incident reports exposing systematic control failures that threatened careers ascending through administrative hierarchy. Regional directors demanded answers Madigan couldn't provide without admitting fundamental incompetence. How had multi-ethnic cooperation occurred undetected? Why were guard routines predictable enough to exploit systematically? What communication networks existed beneath official surveillance? The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating bureaucratic panic that prioritized damage control over justice. Kowalski had become liability rather than victim. His assault evidence of institutional weakness rather than criminal violence. Within 48 hours, Kowalski received medical transfer to mainland facility for reconstructive surgery that would never restore full function to his dominant hand. Psychological evaluation followed within weeks, documenting post-traumatic stress disorder severe enough to warrant permanent disability discharge. His career ended not with prosecution or public scandal, but with quiet bureaucratic elimination designed to minimize institutional embarrassment. 1 month after spitting in Bumpy Johnson's food, William Kowalski became former corrections officer living on partial pension, his hand permanently weakened, his knee requiring assistance for basic mobility, his nights haunted by calm voice explaining what disrespect costs. Alcatraz needed culprit even without prosecutable evidence. They settled for administrative punishment that avoided courtroom scrutiny. Bumpy received 30 days solitary confinement, not charged with assault itself, which remained unprovable despite universal certainty, but for suspicion of inciting unrest. The charge was bureaucratic rather than criminal, punishment without trial, consequence without evidence. He accepted it with characteristic silence, understanding that 30 days isolation represented acceptable exchange rate for restored respect and demonstrated consequence throughout federal prison system. Inside the suffocating darkness of solitary confinement, stripped of everything except concrete walls and mathematical certainty, Bumpy discovered message scratched deep into rear wall with contraband metal. His fingers traced crude but unmistakable words carved into masonry, respect restored. The rock acknowledges the king. Below the text, 3 symbols representing different factions surrounded rough crown. A cross inside circle for Italian operations. Shamrock for Irish crews. Star of David for Jewish networks. Different backgrounds. Unified signature. Permanent testimony that the alliance had not merely survived investigation, but evolved into something institutional fear could never eliminate. The message was complete. The mathematics had been recalculated. Alcatraz would never be the same. April sunlight filtered through steel mesh windows when Bumpy Johnson stepped from solitary confinement 30 days later, emerging into an Alcatraz that had been quietly, systematically recalibrated by mathematics he had imposed through strategic application of consequence. The concrete walls remained identical, the regulations unchanged, but the behavioral dynamics governing 247 inmates and their keepers had shifted in ways the Bureau would never publicly acknowledge. The transformation was subtle but absolute, visible in small adjustments that collectively represented institutional capitulation to invisible hierarchies operating with more efficiency than official policy. Guards moved with measured professionalism where casual cruelty had once flourished. Strip searches became procedural rather than theatrical. Racial slurs disappeared from daily interactions, replaced by careful courtesy that acknowledged respect as survival requirement rather than optional gesture. The mess hall operated under unspoken governance structure, where disputes resolved themselves through quiet negotiation before escalating to violence that might disrupt the new equilibrium. When gambling debts arose, they were settled through channels that ended at Bumpy's bunk or Salerno's chess table. Contraband flowed with regulated efficiency that prevented the chaos administration feared more than organized distribution. Violence became less random, more transactional, applied with surgical precision rather than emotional outburst. Decades later, declassified Bureau of Prisons memoranda revealed what officials understood, but refused to publicly admit in 1956. One document, stamped confidential and buried until Freedom of Information requests forced its release, contained language that validated everything Bumpy knew about power dynamics while scandalizing prison reform advocates. The memo acknowledged that prisoner 1117 had established unauthorized but functional leadership among inmate population, creating governance structure that paradoxically reduced violence while undermining official authority. In bureaucratic language designed to obscure uncomfortable truths, the federal government essentially admitted defeat, recognizing that some men commanded respect that concrete barriers could contain but never eliminate. William Kowalski never wore corrections uniform again. Medical discharge became permanent exile from profession that had defined his identity and justified his prejudices. The physical injuries healed imperfectly, leaving permanent limp and weakened grip that transformed simple tasks into frustrating reminders of systematic humiliation. Post-traumatic stress disorder manifested in night terrors that replayed calm voice explaining what disrespect costs, in paranoia that made crowded spaces feel like potential ambush sites, in rage that consumed relationships and employment opportunities with equal efficiency. Alcohol became medication, then addiction, then slow-motion suicide. He died at 43 from liver failure, alone in Chicago apartment, discovered 3 days after his heart stopped. The official cause listed cirrhosis, but everyone who knew the story understood the real timeline. The shower block beating had killed him methodically, with the same precision that had shattered his kneecap years earlier. The story spread through federal prison system with velocity that transformed legend into institutional policy. Guard training protocols shifted across the system without official announcements. Seminars began emphasizing de-escalation over confrontation, professional distance over personal dominance, systematic oversight over individual fiefdoms where abuse flourished without accountability. Bumpy had achieved what decades of civil rights litigation could not, forced institutional change through demonstration of consequence rather than appeals to conscience. When asked years later whether the incident represented justice or vengeance, he provided characteristically direct answer: respect is currency. You can earn it, buy it, or take it. But you cannot live without it. December 1963 brought cold morning when Bumpy Johnson walked through Alcatraz gates as free man, carrying small box of personal effects and reputation that would outlive him. Reporter from San Francisco Chronicle, covering routine prisoner release, recognized the name and asked about the Kowalski incident that had become prison system legend. For the first time anyone could remember during his entire sentence, Bumpy smiled, not with warmth or humor, but with satisfaction of mathematician confirming equation solved correctly. I was a model prisoner. I just modeled something different than what they expected. Alcatraz functioned as graduate school for Ellsworth Johnson, where he earned a doctorate in the physics of power that would govern criminal empires for decades. What entered the Rock as regional Harlem operator emerged 8 years later as architect of systematic respect enforcement. His philosophy crystallized through maximum security crucible into operational doctrine that transcended simple criminality. The Kowalski incident had not been aberration, but perfect distillation of principles that treated violence as investment capital, respect as negotiable currency, and reputation as inherited wealth compounding across generations. His post-incarceration philosophy operated on 3 fundamental axioms proven under conditions where miscalculation meant death or permanent isolation. Respect was currency more valuable than cash, negotiable across all ethnic and organizational boundaries, requiring constant defense against inflation through demonstrated consequence. Violence was investment requiring careful cost-benefit analysis, deployed only when returns justified expenditure, never as emotional release, but as precision instrument of policy enforcement. Reputation was inherited wealth, an asset class that could be leveraged across decades and geographies, protecting descendants long after original architect had died. These weren't abstract theories, but operational guidelines that would govern his 1960s empire with mathematical precision. The alliances forged during that March morning in 1956 became structural beams of his post-release dominance. When he walked Harlem streets in 1963, he carried no money, no official title, no legal assets, but possessed something infinitely more valuable: networks that made him untouchable. Fat Tony Salerno's Italian connections opened doors previously closed to black operators, creating partnerships that moved heroin through East Coast distribution networks with efficiency that impressed even skeptical Sicilian traditionalists. Patrick McGrath's Irish longshoremen controlled port access from Boston to Baltimore, enabling contraband flow that enriched all participants while maintaining plausible deniability through layered intermediaries. Samuel Levine's Jewish financial expertise transformed street-level gambling operations into sophisticated money laundering enterprises that withstood ear scrutiny with techniques that would have impressed legitimate bankers. What appeared to Harlem police as simple resurgence of neighborhood boss was actually surface reflection of national criminal infrastructure that had quietly decided this one black man represented too valuable an asset to ignore. Italian capos steered narcotics opportunities his way instead of to younger, unproven hustlers. Irish trucking unions guaranteed safe passage for shipments requiring invisibility. Jewish bookmakers partnered with Bumpy's numbers bankers, blending old uptown policy operations with syndicate-level financing. The Rock had transformed local operator into national figure, whose word carried weight across organizational boundaries that usually meant war. Historically, the Alcatraz alliance represents documented case of successful interracial criminal cooperation predating broader civil rights coalitions by nearly a decade. While politicians debated integration on television and activists marched through southern streets demanding equality, Black, Italian, Irish, and Jewish inmates had already executed joint venture with clear objectives, defined roles, and shared risk distribution. Criminal necessity achieved what moral arguments could not, proving that shared interest trumped racial prejudice when consequences were immediate and survival depended on cooperation. In perverse inversion of American politics, men labeled criminals achieved racial integration through ruthless logic, while the country outside remained segregated in schools, buses, and voting booths. The cost analysis of his Alcatraz years revealed counterintuitive mathematics that confounded conventional wisdom about incarceration. 8 years removed from Harlem Street should have destroyed his empire, allowing younger competitors to claim territory and eliminate aging operator returning from federal custody. Instead, he had converted temporary confinement into permanent networks that generated returns measured in decades rather than quarters. The prison time represented expensive but profitable investment, trading immediate freedom for alliances that protected him until natural death 5 years later. When prosecutors could indict his body, they discovered his reputation remained beyond their jurisdiction, shielded by connections that transcended ethnic boundaries and geographical limitations. Modern prison culture still operates on templates Bumpy established during systematic respect enforcement. Federal facilities from Leavenworth to Marion exhibit governance structures eerily similar to what emerged at Alcatraz after Kowalski's education. Multi-ethnic alliances, strategic violence deployed with surgical precision rather than emotional chaos, systematic enforcement protocols that reduce random violence while maintaining clear hierarchies. Guards receive training emphasizing professional distance, specifically because institutional memory recalls what happens when personal dominance replaces procedural authority. The Bureau never publicly credited Bumpy with reforming their system, but internal documents and generational knowledge among corrections officers tell different story about power dynamics inside maximum security facilities. Kowalski's fatal error was philosophical rather than tactical, revealing fundamental misunderstanding about mathematics governing human hierarchies. He assumed institutional power trumped personal power, that federal uniform created immunity from consequence, that authority granted by the state could override natural laws governing respect between men. He believed bureaucracy protected him from accountability, that concrete walls and official policy made him untouchable. The spit was merely symptom of deeper cognitive failure, assuming the badge made him predator when he was simply prey wearing costume jewelry. He failed to recognize that some men carry kingdoms inside them that no prison can confine, that power exists independent of institutional validation. July 1968 brought Bumpy's death from massive heart attack on Harlem street corner, his body collapsing not in prison infirmary or hospital bed, but surrounded by community he had both exploited and protected. His funeral was attended by royalty from every criminal organization operating in New York, men who normally communicated through violence rather than diplomacy standing shoulder to shoulder in genuine mourning. Italian capos, Irish gunmen, Jewish financiers, black operators, all paying tribute to man who had proven dignity transcends institutional permission. They weren't just honoring gangster, but acknowledging sovereign power who had operated by his own constitution, enforced through systematic application of consequence rather than appeals to authority. No epitaph was ever carved into marble headstone, but his true inscription exists in whispered stories and institutional adjustments that outlived all participants. He proved that dignity isn't given by courts, wardens, or governments, but taken by individuals with the mathematics to enforce it. The Kowalski incident was never about simple prison violence, but represented systematic architecture of respect, calculated engineering of consequence, and cold precision required to transform humiliation into legend. Kowalski spat in Bumpy's food, expecting submission, anticipating broken spirit, and accepted degradation. Instead, he received masterclass in strategic retribution that destroyed his career, his health, and ultimately his life through compound interest, calculated in blood, reputation, and institutional fear. The Bureau buried the incident in classified files, hoping administrative amnesia would erase uncomfortable lessons about power dynamics inside their facilities. But truth echoed through every cell block in America for decades afterward, whispered between inmates, acknowledged by guards who understood the mathematics even when policy manuals claimed otherwise. Some men cannot be broken by concrete and steel, only temporarily contained while they redraw the map inside the walls. And when you choose to disrespect such a man in public, you don't simply invite retaliation, but trigger equation, where payment arrives with compound interest, enforced through systematic precision that transforms individual humiliation into institutional legend that governs human hierarchies. Regardless of what uniforms claim to represent,